This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This is the story of a very special collection, an archive that was started in the 1980s by a young woman hoping to keep her job, a dream job, working alongside one of popular music's most prolific, enigmatic, and revolutionary innovators. Over the years, that archive was often rumored about, shrouded in mystery, practically an urban legend among music fans. But it started to receive a lot more scrutiny after the musician in question unexpectedly passed away.
We begin with the sad breaking news. He was possibly the most talented, charismatic, entertaining, influential, and barrier-breaking musician of his generation. Prince, the Purple One, died today at the age of 57. The cause of death is not yet known. We do know
when pop superstar Prince died in 2016 at the age of 57, the accolades came pouring in. Prince, of course, dazzled audiences for decades, scoring dozens of pop and R&B hits, including the iconic Purple Rain, 1999, Kiss, Raspberry Beret, Sign of the Times, and When Doves Cry, to name only a few. He won 7 Grammys, an Oscar for the score to his hit film Purple Rain, and entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility in 2004. A workaholic in the studio, Prince was constantly recording, producing far more material than he could ever hope to squeeze onto his albums. His perfectionism and tireless work ethic resulted in some of the most beloved hit songs of their time. But the sheer volume of his output made it a challenge for his colleagues in the studio to keep track of it all. And that's how we arrive at the story of Susan Rogers. As a young studio engineer and audio technician, Susan worked for the Purple One from 1983 to 1987, right in the heart of his hit-making prime. The demands of the job and her boss meant that Susan had to have access to Prince's previously recorded work at the ready, day or night. It was Susan who first sought to catalog Prince's work, assembling an archive of audio and video that over the past few decades has moved around, most famously spending time in Prince's Paisley Park studios outside of Minneapolis, in an area that came to be known among Prince fans as the Vault. These days, the music is stored at a facility in California. While the archive that Susan started served Prince well over the course of his career, it's become even more important since his death. The Prince estate continues to mine the depths of the vault, culling material for an ongoing series of new releases, as well as greatly expanded re-releases of older Prince albums. Susan, meanwhile, went on to mix, engineer, and produce other artists, including David Byrne, Tricky, and Bare Naked Ladies. And these days she's a professor, teaching music production at the prestigious Berklee College of Music in Boston. But she remains as big a fan of Prince's work as anyone, even contributing liner notes to the expanded re-release of the Sign of the Times album in 2020. And she's got her own impressive archive of stories from her time working with Prince, as well as some very special personal items. More on those later. For Susan, the story of her connection with Prince began when her future employer put out the call for some studio assistants.
I joined Prince in the summer of 1983. He was just coming off the 1999 tour, and while he was on the 1999 tour, he negotiated with and got the green light with Warner Brothers to make this movie, the semi-autobiographical movie of his life, which would be Purple Rain. And he, right away, because he always recorded on tour, was getting songs together for the movie and the soundtrack album. So he knew he wanted to take his home-based production to a higher level, not musically speaking, but technically speaking. So he asked his management to find him an audio technician. And as I was told, he asked management, find me someone experienced from New York or LA. So someone who had been in the industry. His management was based out of Los Angeles, so they put the word out through Westlake Audio that Prince was looking for a full-time technician. My former boyfriend, a sweetheart, John Sacchetti, was Westlake's chief tech. And as soon as Westlake heard Prince was looking for a technician, John just said to Glenn Phoenix, his boss, he said, tell Prince his search is over. I've got the perfect person for him. So he knew I was such a huge Prince fan, and I was an audio tech. I was working with Crosby, Stills and Nash at their studio in Hollywood at the time. And so as soon as John called me and said this job is available, I said the same thing as John said. I said, tell Prince he's done looking. It's gonna be me. And management interviewed me, and I got the job, and I moved straight away out to Minnesota.
And did you hit it off with him right away?
I suppose I hit it off fine. He was so taciturn. He just didn't talk much. And that's how he liked it. He liked to give his employees, his staff, his band members instruction, but actually to engage in conversation, no. Prince wasn't like that. So, and that was fine with me. That worked out really beautifully because I wouldn't have known what to converse with him about anyway. You know, I was just this big fan, and I knew it wouldn't make any sense to be intimidated by him. That wouldn't serve him, and I wouldn't keep my job for very long. So I had to do what I was brought there to do, make sure that technically everything was working so that he could work morning, noon, and night as quickly as he liked to, so that he could move from one instrument to another, because he played most of the instruments himself unless we were recording at rehearsal. I also had to set up recording equipment at his rehearsal. So that meant maintaining his home studio, which was a very, very modest little affair, but also having recording equipment at rehearsal as well, so that wherever he was, we could be recording.
Because Prince would work on music whenever the urge hit him, Susan had to be ready to go whenever he was. Were you essentially on call around the clock?
Yeah, it was more than on call because he wanted to spend his days recording. So the way it kind of worked was, let's say, for example, rehearsal would start at 10 a.m. He'd usually be the first one there. So you had to get to rehearsal before the boss showed up. And of course, you had to turn everything on. You had to tune instruments. You had to fire up the PA and fire up the recording equipment as well. So you get there 9 a.m. or so, and he comes in, the band comes in, and we'd rehearse for just hours and hours and hours. And this is a warehouse with loading docks and things like that. He didn't need anything fancy, but we'd spend the day doing that. And more often than not, he would have written a new song either the night before, or he comes up with a groove at rehearsal, and that inspires him, and he writes lyrics. And so I've got the multi-track there. I've got a splitter snake on stage that's feeding both the monitor mix console and the recording console, so I can record his rehearsals. And then the band goes home 7 o'clock, and he and I stay either at the warehouse and we continue just pleasantly working through the night to finish up this song, or we take the tape, we move over to his home studio, and we finish it up at home. And we'd finish, well, it could be 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd go home, get a few hours sleep, and then start all over again the next day. Often, my days started with the phone ringing. So I'd go home and I would have been asleep for 3 or 4 hours, and the phone rings, and it's either him or it's someone on his staff who says, you're needed. And that means he's had his usual 4 hours of sleep, and I got to get straight over there to the studio. That's just how the days went.
That jam-packed schedule resulted in a lot of recordings, and Susan quickly realized that in order to do the work Prince expected of her, it would enhance her job performance and job security to have a handle on where everything was kept.
I realized right away I'm going to be in trouble if I don't know where all his tapes are, because he'd turn to you at 2 o'clock in the morning and he'd say, can you bring me the tape of something or other? And I didn't know where these things were. I was a new employee. So it became clear that one of the first things I needed to do was just to gather up all his material, everything he had recorded. So I began, in what little free time I had, I began finding all these things. And they were scattered around his home. They were at rehearsal. They were in recording studios in Minneapolis, where he had worked prior to having a home studio. And many of them were out at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles, and plus a few other studios in LA that he had tried before he ended up at Sunset. And some of his material was at Warner Brothers in Burbank. So little by little, calling and giving them our FedEx number and having the tapes boxed and shipped out to us, I began amassing all of his recorded work. Staff in his office then took over, and they came up with a coding system. We had a database, and we knew where to find our 2-inch tapes and our 1/4-inch tapes and our 1/2-inch tapes.
With 5 albums under his belt before he recorded Purple Rain, Prince had a lot of material, and at the time, Susan and the rest of the Prince team lacked a secure, dedicated place to store all of the recordings.
Because we didn't have a vault yet, we found a record storage facility that was nearby rehearsal, and this facility allowed us access to it 24/7. So if you wanted a tape at 2 o'clock in the morning, all you had to do was call a certain phone number, someone would pick up, and you'd say, "I'm coming in to get box 0192, and they'd meet you there, and they'd get the box, and the box was a big gray plastic bin that could hold, I think, 6 2-inch tapes, maybe only 4 2-inch tapes, and then a number of 1/2-inch or 1/4-inch tapes. So they'd pull the box down because they had the database, and we'd pull our tapes out. Prince was kind of proud of that, and I remember, this might have been 84, pretty early on, a reporter from Rolling Stone came to spend a few days with us, and Prince and I and some of his folks took this reporter over to this storage facility just to show this is where the tapes are kept, and there's an awful lot of them.
So he didn't specifically ask you to create the vault. This was something you took on yourself out of necessity, it sounds like.
Right. He didn't ask me to create it. I just did because I wanted to keep my job, and it seemed like the smart thing to do. He was pleased about that. He was glad that someone was taking the initiative, and this is why when we first started drawing up plans for Paisley Park Studios, he included a vault, something that would be like this commercial facility we rented, but would belong to him alone.
But Susan didn't have everything within reach, so she reached out for a little help, and her own naivete helped as well. As you started collecting all these tapes, you started reaching out to other sources, outside studios in particular, to retrieve other tapes. Were they easy to work with as far as collecting what you were looking for?
Oh, the studios were great because they recognized that Prince was a rising star. He was an important client. And if his engineer called and said, "I need these tapes," they're more than happy to oblige. The thing I ended up doing, which I was too naive to know was actually a problem, was I called Warner Brothers, asked to speak to the person in the Warner Brothers Records tape vault. It was pretty bold of me, but I would say, Prince wants the masters, side A and side B of the Controversy album, or just whatever it was. And do you have any Prince tapes there in the vault? And he needs them. Can you send them? The folks who worked in the vault, who I spoke to on the phone anyway, weren't high enough in the hierarchy to recognize that this was probably not a proper request. I don't know anything about Prince's business dealings, but, the masters technically belonged to the record label that paid for it. So for me to call and ask for the masters, it's not normally done.
I love that you called sort of naively. It's almost like you filed out under "you don't know what you don't know." Yeah. Naivety can lead to some really happy accidents now and then. Maybe you can call the Louvre and ask if you can have the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, just tell them, I need to borrow that. You mind sending it? Here's my FedEx number. I'm packing that up and sending it here.
Susan didn't just record rehearsals and in the studio. She also toured with Prince and his band, mixing and recording things along the way. Going on tour, I did not mix sound for him on tour. That's a specialized skill, and I did not have that skill. But I did mix occasionally some of the after parties, because of course I could do the smaller clubs and I could do rehearsal. That wasn't so onerous.
But yeah, do that, and as well as recording shows in a mobile truck. So for the big cities like LA and New York and the New Orleans Superdome, we would hire a mobile recording truck, and we could record sound checks and then record the shows themselves. Man, that was fun. It's so exciting to record a live show.
Along with the excitement that came with those experiences was the fact that Prince turned out to be a pretty generous guy on the road, giving Susan nightly opportunities to build her skills. In fact, he was generous to all the crew.
The Purple Rain tour was my first tour, and there was a very experienced tour manager and a very experienced crew. So our tour manager gathered us all together in a nearby hotel. We had the first big meeting, and the thing that I remember that generated the most excitement of that meeting was when this fellow, the tour manager, said to all of us in the room, "Folks, our boss is a really generous boss. We're going to be out on the road for a long time. He wants each and every one of you to have your own room." And the crew just cheered. Later, the more experienced folks told me afterward, they said, "That's not customary. Usually the bands want to save money and all the crew members have to double up." But that was Prince. The money that he was making didn't go to cars and boats and luxury items. That just wasn't him. The money he was making fed back into his artistry, and he knew that a happy crew is going to make a better tour. So that's what he did.
Yeah, and that kind of goes against the image I sort of have of him as being kind of standoffish and maybe insular in some ways, but sounds like that is not the case.
Yeah, both of those images are correct. So he really, really was quite naturally shy. I mean, shy is the right word. Aloof is not the right word. He was shy. There was a day when his mother came over to the house and she brought a box of some of his childhood things, and inside was some of his report cards from when he was a little kid. And he saw me looking at that box and he said, "You can look in it if you want." And I pawed through it and I saw that his teachers had written about him. He is shy. He's shy and quiet, but he's obviously bright and sensitive. He's respectful of authority. That 10-year-old portrait was in line with the man I knew him to be. So he had a warm heart, but he was a quiet fellow who did preserve himself apart from others, I think, so that he could meet his career goals, so that he could get the work done that he needed to do.
Uh-huh. And I like that his mom had a little vault too.
Yeah, well, she had a few things of his. It wasn't much. It was I'm picturing the box now, and it was pretty darn small. But she had a few things from his childhood. She was moving, I think, to a new place, and she brought some things over.
Do you have any personal favorites out of all the music that you archived in the vault? Does anything kind of stand out as being particularly noteworthy or unusual?
Yeah, there were wonderful things for the performances, for the songs themselves. And then there were, of course, some really incredible memories. Incredible for the amount of suffering that we did, and incredible for how fun it was or how great it was. So a lot of songs stand out. I am especially fond of Condition of the Heart on the Around the World in a Day album. The vocal performance just wipes me out. And the lyric writing, he's just so sublimely honest.
There was a girl in Paris whom they sent a letter to, hoping she would answer back. Now wasn't that a fool? Her emotion on the part of a sometimes lonely musician, acting out a whim is only good for a condition of the heart.
And that lyric writing and the vocal is just so fearless. I remember Power Fantastic, which didn't make it onto, I think it made onto a Prince Forever album, or maybe the Greatest Hits B-Sides album, but it was a song written by Lisa Coleman, and he performed it, the band performed it absolutely beautifully. We recorded that live at his home. I remember just fun stuff, just loads and loads of fun stuff, and I remember struggles as well. The song Joy and Repetition, it came out after I left him, but it has one of my favorite guitar solos of his, and again, the vocal performance will just knock you out. There's a song called Train on the big 94-track Sign of the Times box set.
There's a train that's leaving in the morning that will take you straight to Santa Fe. If you feel the thing we got just can't go on, I won't stand in your way. I won't stand in your way. I won't stand in your way.
That song Train, oh, it's so funky to me. I just love it. There's quite a lot of those.
And it sounds like a fair amount of stuff from the vault has gotten out and continues to get out, so it's great that we're all able to hear it as well.
Yes, I want to say that the fellow who's in charge of Prince's archive, a former Warner Brothers record executive named Michael Howe, is one of the finest human beings I've ever worked with in the music business. Conscientious, smart, courteous, responsible. I mean, this guy is truly remarkable. I love that he's in charge of Prince's archiving. The estate and Michael Howe have worked really hard to select pieces for release that they think, to the best of their knowledge, would serve Prince well. They have to make some tough decisions, including, should we be releasing these things from the vault? Is it right, after an artist passes away, is it right to make this decision and release the things that he or she didn't release during their lifetime? I've thought about it. I know everyone who's involved with his estate has thought about it. And I've reached a conclusion that, to the best of my knowledge and understanding, is the right conclusion.
And regarding the vault itself, do you have any sense as to what we're talking about in terms of a size?
The only sense that I could give you is to just use the word massive. So the physical vault itself was a fairly modest room in terms of its size. It was like a bank vault. It still exists. So a bank vault. And if I had to say in feet, just in my mind's eye, I might say 25 feet by 15 feet. Just a regular rectangular room when it was first built. And there were metal shelves in there to hold all of the tapes. By the time it was the early 90s, folks who worked with Prince were telling me that they couldn't get the vault door closed because it was literally just full to overflowing. Tapes were spilling out into the anteroom in front of the vault door. And that was in the 90s. So add another 30 years to that, and you get a sense of just how much material would be there. Now, for every song he recorded, we've got to remember that there were all these rehearsal tapes and show tapes. So when he was awake, he wanted to have a musical instrument in his hands. He wanted to get through personal business, professional business as soon as possible so he could be playing. And if he's playing, he's recording. So we recorded rehearsals. We recorded the shows when we were on tour. We recorded after parties. There's not only audio tapes, but there are videotapes from rehearsal, from the live shows, and just so many cassettes, and I'm sure later on DATs and things like that from his professional life.
Besides Michael Howe, Susan says there aren't a lot of people weighing in on which tracks from the vault are likely to see the light of day on a future Prince release.
Frankly, there's the estate, and that includes lawyers, and that includes next of kin, although there weren't many of those, but there are a few people who were related to Prince, and it includes Trevor Guy. Trevor was managing, kind of an operations manager for Paisley Park, so Trevor is involved, and then Michael Howe has reached out to engineers involved in the original recordings that he's considering for release, just to get our insight, just to try to glean what Prince was going through or thinking, or what his aims were during the making of these recordings. I believe that Prince would endorse our releasing these pieces from the vault. And the reason I think so is because he was proud of everything we did. Not everything made it onto a record, but he was proud of everything that went into that vault. I say that with some confidence because of the one instance where we finished recording a song and he had me put all 24 tracks in record and erase it, the original version of this song called Wally. So I knew if Prince didn't want something heard, Prince would take matters into his own hands and destroy the tape. So all those things that were in the vault were things he wasn't ready to release just now, but didn't mean he wouldn't have wanted it released.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask you, did Prince ever ask you to remove anything from the vault permanently? It sounds like that one example might be it.
And that was the only time in my slightly over 4 years with him, the only time we ever deliberately destroyed something. It was mind-blowing, but it was only the one time.
Susan, of course, has a Prince archive of her own, mostly an internal one consisting of recollections of working with him. Mixed in among those memories of musical mastery are stories of times when Prince exhibited his warmer side. Can you tell the story of when you bought a house, I think in a nice part of town, and he was really happy for you?
Oh, that was one of the sweetest things, and it was so completely unexpected. So we were in Los Angeles, this probably was 86, 85 maybe, working at Sunset Sound. And we had had a break after the tour, and after the tour I had very little of a break, but I had just enough time that I could do a little house hunting, and I found a condominium on Lake Harriet in Minneapolis, and I put that down payment and then just, got on a plane and flew out to Los Angeles to record. So we were there at Sunset Sound and we were in the control room and the real estate agent called and I had to take the call. So I had to excuse myself from the control room, which I really hated to do, but I had to. And I went in the other room and I took the phone call and I came back into the control room and I apologized to Prince. I said, I'm sorry, I had to take that call. I've just bought a condominium on Lake Harriet and that was important. I was back to work. And Prince, I didn't notice it, but he got up a minute later and went and talked to Gilbert Davidson. Gilbert worked for him as kind of a valet and a personal assistant. And 20, 30 minutes later, Gilbert came back in, and he had a bottle of champagne and some glasses. And we didn't have alcohol in the studio with Prince during those days. So this was the middle of the day, bottle of champagne. And Prince had the champagne, and he said to me, when I was a kid, I used to dream that I would live in a house on Lake Harriet, and now I have employees who live on Lake Harriet. He just was really happy and proud, and he poured some champagne, and we had a drink, and it was very, very sweet. Some of the sweetest moments I had with him were where we were acknowledging or recognizing that our dreams were coming true, that our dreams were different from one another's, but that we were achieving things that we dreamt might have been possible. That was pretty great.
Yeah, it's such a great story. I had to ask about it. And I think I also heard or read someplace that you cooked with him, at least at one point.
Yeah, he had a sweet tooth, and he knew that I could bake. And occasionally, he wouldn't do this often because he didn't take advantage of his employees, but there'd be every now and then we'd be working on a quiet Sunday at home, just the two of us at his house. And, we're getting through it pretty quietly, but it's piecemeal, one track at a time. And every now and then he'd turn to me and he'd say, what would be really good right now? Hot chocolate. Or chocolate chip cookies, or just something, brownies or something. And I'd take the hint and I'd say, yeah, that would be great. Shall I whip something up? And he'd say, well, yeah, if you want to, I'd jump in the car, go to the store, get the stuff, come back, check in with him, and then I could be upstairs in the kitchen and getting a few things done. Someone else listening might think, he was taking advantage of you, but goodness, no, it didn't feel anything like that. It felt like actually he was giving me a little bit of a break. We worked so many hours, and to have just that little respite there to do something other than recording, well, that was kind of fun. I was always happy to do it.
Okay, if you like stories about Prince and baked goods, how about one more from Susan's memory bank?
Would you like to know about the pie story?
I don't think I know the pie story.
Oh, gee. Well, early in my time with him, he started filming the Purple Rain movie. Because he's on the movie set, I don't have as much to do. I'm providing audio during the club scenes where there's music involved, but if he's shooting scenes in his home, like he was on this particular night, his fake movie home, I'm not needed for anything. Anyway, I was at home. I'm thinking I should be helpful. I should be doing something. And I thought, I know, I'll bake him a pie. Why I thought a guy making a movie needs a pie, I have no idea, but it just seemed like that's the right thing to do. So I went to the store and I got the ingredients and I came back and I whipped up an apple pie and I drove down to the movie set. And it wasn't until I arrived on the set that I realized, what the hell am I doing here with a pie? But I thought to myself, okay, but I'm going to own it. This is a decision I made, and I'm going to present this as though this is a really good idea. So I found out where his trailer was, and I went walking up to his trailer. He was in between shots, and I knocked on the door, and he opened it, and I said, Prince, I've made you a pie. And he looked at me, and he looked at the pie, and he said, a pie? And I said, yeah, a pie. Really serious. And he said, thank you. And he took the pie and then he said, hang on a second. And he turned around, put down the pie and turned back to me. And he had one of those little boxes of Tic Tacs, those little mints. And I knew what he was doing and I stuck my hand out and he put some Tic Tacs into my hand. And we just kind of did that little formal bow, like, thank you very much, the exchanging of the gifts. And I went home. But after that pie, my relationship with him changed a little bit. He realized she's just waiting for something to do. Keep this woman busy because she wants to contribute. And he gave me more work to do after that, which was quite welcome.
And you found a way to get Tic Tacs.
And I get a couple of Tic Tacs out of it. Yeah.
And so I have to ask you the question you probably get asked all the time. As an engineer, how and why did you decide to stop working for Prince, arguably at the peak of his commercial powers?
It was not my decision entirely, that's for sure, but there were a number of factors involved. First and foremost, as Paisley Park Studios had just opened its doors just a few months before I left Prince's employ. And with the studio open, he can now work differently at home than he's ever worked before. He's got more than one room. He's got a staff of people. It's not just Prince and his one engineer working at rehearsal or working at the home studio. This is a proper commercial facility now, and he's got a staff of engineers. And he and I had been together over 4 years and pretty much joined at the hip because he recorded every day. So he was probably just as sick of me as I was sick of this grind. And it felt a bit like a tour of duty, like exciting, thrilling, one-of-a-kind experience, but not sustainable. You couldn't keep up that pace for too long because it was very, very difficult. You know, I didn't have birthdays or Christmas or time with my family or anything like that because I was with him all the time. So it was one night, I was out in Los Angeles working on post-production for the Sign of the Times concert film, and he was in Minneapolis, and one of the technicians who was helping me on that film was attractive and single, and I went out on a date with this fellow, and Prince couldn't reach me that night because we didn't have cell phones and things. We had beepers, but I don't think I answered my beeper. I was out on a date for the first time in 4 years. And Prince was not happy about that. He got on a plane, came to L.A., and confronted me the next morning. And he asked me where I was the night before, and I said I was on a date. And we looked at each other, and it was pretty clear. He needed me to not do that. He needed me to be the one I'd always been, and I needed to no longer be the one I'd always been. So it was just a fork in the road, and we both had to go our separate ways. I will honestly say it was amiable. There were certainly no fights. There was no animosity between us, but it was a natural parting of the ways.
So in 2020, you were pulled back into the Prince camp to contribute liner notes for the super deluxe edition of the Sign of the Times album. And I think there are like 45 previously unreleased songs on that release. Mm-hmm. What was that like, revisiting all that unreleased material that you had undoubtedly archived years before?
It's just warmly thrilling. It's poignant, of course. You know, those of us who knew him, we miss him. We loved him. he could be a real pain sometimes. He'd be the first to admit that. But there was also a lot of love there. So hearing some of those pieces and revisiting those times is a little bit bittersweet. Bitter because he's gone and those days are gone, and sweet because, damn, there's some great work there. I will be honest and say it's a little bit hard. When I worked with Prince, I was in my 20s. I was a beginner, a really fortunate beginner, and a well-trained beginner as engineers go, well-trained in the sense that I knew my audio technology, but I wasn't trained as a record maker, that's for sure. So I was extremely naive in some ways. And when I listen to these things now, I'm listening from the perspective of a woman in her 60s who's a PhD, who's had a #1 record as a producer and several #1 records as a mixer and an engineer, and someone with a lot more experience. And so it's funny, to pull the rubber band back so far that you're back in those days when you didn't know a hell of a lot and you were just hoping to get through each day and not mess up, and then snap that rubber band, and now suddenly you're standing in a room in front of students and you're the expert. You're the one in the room who knows. And to traverse that time travel, requires a more mental fortitude than I might have predicted.
And you wrote some liner notes as well.
Yeah, writing the liner notes, I was just tremendously pleased to be asked to do that. And I was also asked for the Purple Rain Deluxe Edition that came out in 2017 to write some notes. And I think the world of Michael Howe, and he's the one who issued the invitation and asked me if I would do this writing. So it was a real joy to share memories and just reflect on those times.
Susan has tons of memories of working with Prince and starting the archive that filled up the vault. But it begs the question, do you have any personal memorabilia or items that you've held on to from your days working with Prince?
Well, I was a good employee, and I was an honest one, and I never took things that didn't belong to me. I'm not naming names. I know that there were a few people who took things that weren't theirs to take, and I was not one of them. So a couple of things I have just by accident. For example, Prince and I both kept those college-ruled spiral notebooks at the studio. He had lots of them because that's what he'd use to write his lyrics in. And there were a couple of times when he accidentally wrote his lyrics in my notebook and not his. So I've got lyrics to a couple of songs at home. Something that I treasure very, very much was a note he wrote for me and left it on the console when I was called in the morning to come to his home studio and work. And it said what instruments he wanted set up and what sounds he wanted on them. On this particular song, it doesn't say what the song was, but he wanted the piano upstairs mic'd and he wanted a big long reverb. It said like Purple Rain. He wanted his distorted guitar sound and a few other things, and he listed, a big drum sound. Yeah, we were doing acoustic drums, and he wrote a big drum sound we need. And then at the bottom of the note, he wrote, the faster you work, the faster I can work, or something like that. And then he wrote, save my blood pressure, please, which was so funny. I mean, come on, you weigh 125 pounds. You don't have blood pressure. Save my blood pressure, please. Yeah. Of course I'm going to work as fast as I can. Why wouldn't I? That's what I've been doing every day for 4 years, is working as fast as possible for you. So yeah, I have that. And, and I have a couple of, like birthday cards and things that he signed, and those are precious to me.
I bet. I thought you were going to tell me you had a box of Tic Tacs or something.
No, I didn't say that. No, myself, I don't tend to be nostalgic. So in hindsight, I definitely wish I had kept more things, but I was so in the moment. I didn't think about the future at all.
So one last question for you. How do you think those intense years in Minneapolis prepared you for the rest of your career as an engineer, producer, even a professor? I mean, as you look back, is there any sort of through line that can be drawn through it all?
The producer, Greg Wells, who's a friend of mine, came to visit Berkeley about 5-6 years ago, and he was giving a big talk to all of the students in the music production and engineering major. Now, Greg has worked with just so many artists, great artists, and Greg looked out at our kids and he said, you guys, sitting here today, you have no idea how good is. Good is stupid good. Like if you work with a Katy Perry or Lana Del Rey or name any legendary artist, good is something, to use Prince's words, that you might say those kinds of cars don't pass you every day. So the thing I learned from Prince was how good can be. To be in a room with him, to watch him go from acoustic drums, to pick up the bass, pick up the rhythm guitar, to do a guitar solo, play piano, to play keys, to do a vocal, layer all his backing vocals, to watch that. The compass needle bent so far that it broke. Another one of Prince's engineers from later in Prince's life, a fellow named Dylan Dresdow, said on a panel once, he said, after Prince, you had to unlearn Prince, because otherwise you'd expect every artist to play and sing that well. The difficulty for Wendy and Lisa and myself was that Prince was our first early experience in the recording studio. So we started seeing the bar set that high, and we had to learn what most mortals do in the studio, what they're capable of. That took a little bit of doing. I recognize it now because I've worked with some great talent, but I've come to understand now that Prince was what neuroscientists call a hypercreative, and that's very, very rare. So, the main thing I learned from Prince was just how good can humanly be.
And when you see it, appreciate it.
Yeah, it's rare.
Well, Susan, that's everything I've got for you. On behalf of all Prince fans, I'm so glad that you got the ball rolling on the vault all those years ago, and it sounds like there's so much more for the label and the estate to consider for future new music. I guess I put new music in quotes, but it's exciting to see the things and hear the things that are still coming out. So thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been fun.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I love sharing these memories. So thank you very much.
You bet. Take care.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, Susan Rogers' efforts to archive the work of Prince clearly paved the way for music fans to enjoy music from his massive archive for years and years to come. And her love of music and language has prompted her next big project, a book written for everyday music fans and slated to come out in the fall of 2022, all about the science behind the act of listening to music. Its tentative title, This Is What It Sounds Like, a playful nod to her former boss in Minneapolis. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkowski. My thanks to Susan Rogers for generously sharing stories of archive building and beyond with the legendary Prince. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll find photos of Susan, including one back in her 80s heyday at the recording console, and images of a couple of those handwritten items from Prince she's held onto all these years. There's even a vault image, too. The show's theme is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was provided by Otis McDonald, Track Tribe, and Chad Crouch. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.